Hello, and welcome to our bonus material Irish Modernism's Roundtable podcast from the Centre for Contemporary Art, Derry, Londonderry. In this podcast, you'll hear the second part of the conversation between artists James Ash, Rachel Campbell-Palmer, Philip McCrilly, Grace McMurray, Ben Weir, and my co-curator, Matt Retelich, and me, Catherine Himmelreich. You can listen to part one by searching for CCA Derry Londonderry on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, Google, and any other podcast providers. Enjoy. Seeing how our visitors have been responding to your work, that those imperfections and the fact that it is handmade are visible when you're looking at it, but when it is through the screen, it does seem that's almost artificially pristine, inhuman, perfect. And it's something that, particularly on your work that is the screen where it's exposing the back, it's skewed because of the tensions of the ribbons that are being pulled. And that's very intentional to show that it's not that it's a mistake, it's that we can see that the physicality of the labor there. I wanted to ask, how did you come to make that decision to show that piece in that plane rather than neatly against the wall?
I think through chatting, we had a meeting on Zoom before the show, and Ben brought up the idea of architecture within the home, and I felt like my piece was like a fabric wall. This was me trying to control the environment that was within the gallery. I prefer to show objects that you're not supposed to see, and so that's why I tried to show it in a way so that somebody could have a corner space to sit and just take in the work and not be distracted by other objects within the space.
Grace, I thought it was interesting. You brought up the Bauhaus movement. I'm just sort of like when you're talking about your upbringing and sort of like real working class, and then you're talking about Bauhaus. And I'm kind of interested in the parallels there because although Bauhaus was a very progressive movement in around or before the Nazi Germany came in, but I think the Bauhaus, it only had a one woman master, but it was still a very progressive movement. What way has Bauhaus influenced you?
Yeah, it's in terms of making objects, patterns that appear to be three-dimensional, but they're two-dimensional, and having those around you and what kind of influence that has on you.
We spoke about Annie Albers as well, Chris, didn't we? Very briefly, but I think if I'm not mistaken, Annie Albers found herself in textile and weaving because architecture wasn't accepting women. So that's a really interesting thing, that actually Annie Albers is now incredibly influential, but almost found herself making such sophisticated and beautiful work in spite of the fact of the slightly backwards political nature of the school at that time.
I always enjoyed, Grace, as well, the way you talked about just the process of weaving. And could you tell us a little bit about how you go about that? And then, Rachel, I'd like to ask you about the casting process and the ways of making. So again, I think there are so many interesting connections and overlaps between your works.
The weaving was something that I came upon because I wanted to create like a material that was like an abstract whole in a way. So I found that weaving different strands in different directions, I could make these completely geometric patterns, but in a very tactile way. And a lot of the patterns that I use in the work, it's ribbon that's woven in three different directions. And the main pattern that I use is a patchwork pattern called tumbling blocks, and it's from patchwork from the 1800s, but it's also was used in ancient Greece. It appeared as a mosaic floor design. So some of the works then, I feel like that's a connections with some of Rachel's work. But the kind of woven patterns, I guess it brings into the gallery things that you are surrounded by on a everyday basis in terms of the domestic.
I actually worked a lot in soft sculpture and textiles right the way through art college, and it wasn't till after I left and I did an introductory course to casting that I sort of had this moment of realization. I was like, yes, like this is the language that I've been looking for, that I just wasn't quite reaching with the soft sculptural work that I have been making. So it was like once that the casting process was exposed to me, I was just like, that was me hooked basically. And so I work with like a traditional casting process, and I really enjoy, it's just very satisfying working with those hard materials. And then when you take a new form out of a cast and it works, it's just such a satisfying moment. And I really enjoy the problem solving involved in it. And you're kind of having to work quite methodically through the positive three-dimensional shape that you want to end up with, and backwards to figure out, okay, well, what negative space is going to create that positive in terms of then design and building your molds. And I usually work with, because I like to work quite large scale, I work with wooden molds just because they're more affordable. And just that whole figuring out of every time you build and design a new mold, you know, you have to test it, you have to make sure that you've got your release agents right for that material. And even when you think you've got everything right, sometimes stuff just doesn't work. And then it's like trying to figure out, okay, well, what's gone wrong here? And sort of quite, as I said, methodically examine each step of the process and experiment and try different things. And when Grace was talking earlier just about labour and perfection and control, I was just like, yes, this is exactly some of the same struggles that I have, and maybe tensions in my practice, in that I work quite often in modular forms and in multiples. So I'm casting the same object a number of times in this is manufacturing these shapes and forms. And each time I'm searching for perfection with it, and I want it, you know, to come out with lovely smooth surfaces with no air bubbles. But because I'm using a handmade process to make these forms, that they never are going to be perfect. And in each one, even though they are a multiple, they're different, you know, they're going to be unique. And I really enjoy that about that sort of that tension, that, I don't know, self-virtuous process. But I love through the casting process and how you can kind of see the journey of the material and the casting. So for example, in the surface, like you will see, I guess, a history of how that process has happened and the layers that have been created to make the form. In some of the casts in the massives piece, so massives has 10 irregular cuboid hollow cast forms, and the way that they're cast is built up in a series of layers, and the first layer that you put in your mold is the surface that's going to come out. So that's going to be what's going to be seen. So that's when you always want to make sure that you get right. And in the surface of some of the casts and massives, if you look very closely, you can see the imprint of pencil marks of the numbers and the labels of the different parts of the mold that are then embedded into the surface of the cast, and just, I guess, tells a bit of the story of how that piece was made and the process that's involved. And that's something that really interests me, in how that, I suppose, the surface of the cast is the sort of membrane that shows the process and the journey of its making. And that is something that I quite often align with buildings when I'm thinking about the surface of buildings and how things change around buildings. But some of that history or that experience in that environment is somehow embedded in the surface of buildings and retained there. So yeah, and also the physicality, which Grace talked about, like that is really important. And I often work in a way that, I suppose, in a size and scale that's in relation to my size. So I'm kind of limited by how big I can work, by how heavy a thing I can lift, or how high I can build it. So that's often why I do work in modular forms, so I can create larger works because I can build it up gradually. But quite often forms might be referencing my height, or like a torso, or they would have quite a lot of body kind of analogies or connections. And I think you can really see that in the massive piece, have like these sort of almost like profiles of like heads and shoulders. But that physical interaction, engagement with the process and making it work is really important to me. It is labor, like, but I feel like I need that or I suppose it's just something that feeds my practice, is that connectedness to the materials and the working process.
I think that thing of physicality I'm quite interested in terms of Ben's work. And, you know, Ben, you're in the Netherlands. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You had to work in a very different way. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that experience and how you came to present the artwork that you did.
Yeah, and maybe this comes into a question which maybe is going to come up later about our kind of individual practices and the relationship that I have specifically between art and architecture, because in some ways I don't differentiate them. And I think I really work within the discipline of architecture as opposed to the profession of it. That's the quote that I often talk about with my teaching partner in Queen's, Michael McGarry. That's, I think maybe if we were to talk about what I make as art production as architectural research, but then I think actually if I switch around those terms in my mind, that also makes sense. But maybe there's something about, a kind of a mode of practice where I'm practicing in ways that an architect might in order to produce art. And so it's quite typical that an architect would sit at the computer and draw almost like the kind of the ideal version of something. Architects make drawings, they don't make buildings, directly anyway. They make drawings, and the drawing is the ideal version of the work. It can never really exist, it's almost like platonic. And then it's the job of the builder to build something that is as close to that drawing as possible. In this instance, Catherine Hemmelreich was said builder, for which I am forever grateful.
Your instructions were so fantastic. I think it's one of the easiest to follow. It was like it was like Lego instructions. I loved it. But yeah, carrying 130 blocks and starting it was good fun.
That's good to hear, because I mean, just in this previous conversation about labor and specifically gendered labor, I thought, is it, I'm sending you over information and you make it for me. But yeah, I guess it's just we were kind of victims of circumstance. So I worked in the way that an architect does, which I drew something many times, and then I came up with a final drawing, which worked as a set of instructions. And even in the middle of the construction process, this is still how an architect works. An architect might go onto site and give out direct actions to builders, like, no, that shouldn't be like that. That lintel should be 2 bricks higher. Oh, you've ordered the wrong window color. You need to contact the manufacturer, blah, 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 blah. But then if a change is made on site, you do actually have to go back and you redraw it. And then you issue that as what's known as an AI, like an architect instruction. So the drawing process for me is always the kind of key process. And that's really where my research happens as well, is that I always start with a survey drawing. Like, before I know what I'm going to make, I always have to be highly aware of what's there. So I draw it. And I think drawing your physical surroundings is the best way to kind of come to terms with what you're faced with. And so, I kind of requested a survey drawing of the gallery. And then I could start inserting specific modules, which I knew the size of, which was these lightweight concrete blocks, and I arranged them in such a manner as to make something out of them. My work is almost not a work in its own right. Like, it is a scenography, and it is there to host something. And I knew that Philip was going to be showing a series of objects and research. And I think I proposed to him the idea of a collaboration, or maybe it just came up in conversation, that I proposed to him that I would provide a built context in which he would display his work, almost in a way to kind of strip away that sanitary idea of like a white cube with precious historical artifacts laid out in vitrines, and instead turn it into something which is more akin to a kind of domestic environment. And then that collaboration was really smooth, and it happened in the most 2021 way ever. It was predominantly on Instagram DMs, which was great.
Yeah, it was so nice to be able to make something happen despite the fact that you are overseas. And it was nice showing you the photos as well. And I remember your reaction of the blocks that ordered, expecting them to be identical. But actually, as Rachel was talking about earlier, the changes in colour and texture throughout all of the blocks, they're so different. And the patterns and textures really become apparent when they're constructed in such a way as they are in the show, rather than sort of, covered in a layer of skim or what have you. So Philip's work is positioned on the concrete, on the blocks, and you've got aspects of nature that are coming through there. So we've got gorse wine that's fermenting at the moment during the show. It's still doing its little bubbles every now and again, and a series of syrups and these flowers that's very spiky. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I suppose one of the strands of research that I brought into the exhibition was work I was doing around the queer body in the landscape, and the sort of relationship between cruising and foraging as these deviant practices, and the sort of queer reclamation of property. So I suppose one of my things within the exhibition was to kind of further on the research that I was doing within that context, and I suppose learn more about it. So that strand of research just kind of looked at particular parts of South Belfast, and I really homed in one area, Shaw's Bridge. And in my research then I found that it was actually this really center kind of fracture point of modernist planning, and where things came to a head at one stage, and I wanted to represent that within the exhibition. So at one stage, I think it was in the mid-60s up until 1965, if you owned a piece of land and you put in for planning permission, you were eligible for compensation for its proposed use if it didn't go through. So it meant that a lot of things, unfortunately, were just put through even though they weren't in any way wanted or needed. Local councils couldn't pay for the compensation. And it all came to a head with one person called John Oliver, and he convinced one of the ministers at the time to pay the compensation for this big plan that was in for Shawsbridge that would have totally got rid of all the woodland and the forest and everything and turned it into just a massive residential development. But through his conversations with other people, he knew that things were going to change, and then it meant that government took over planning and they were able to then rightfully refuse planning for stuff without having to pay compensation. So Shawsbridge was saved. And one of the things in Shawsbridge is like an abundance of gorse, and I suppose kind of like a timely kind of in the coming together of the exhibition, like gorse was kind of out and flowering and stuff. So I collected it, made gorse wine, and over the course of the exhibition that's fermenting. I suppose a lot of the work anyway and the show is for me unfolding and not fully resolved. So using the exhibition as some sort of platform or a structure for things to develop. And the objects that are on Ben's sculpture, I suppose I saw that collaboration as a kind of way for both of us to fill in the gaps within each of our work. And I had struggled with finding a device or a means to kind of display the research, because I found that that's quite like an interesting part of my practice is these little things, these little particular histories that kind of went overlooked and unheard. So that I thought it was a really successful way to hint at or gesture at these histories and stuff. And the work in itself, I titled those objects and stuff Death of the Banshee, and that in itself comes from a documentary that was in 1996, I think it was, that RTÉ did around the 50th anniversary of the electrification of rural Ireland. And the documentary in itself kind of presents these two voices of kind of like the greatness and how good it is for Ireland to have electricity, but then also kind of reflects on the potential for the loss of storytelling and this modernization and the potential for an old way of life to go completely overnight and stuff. So these little hints to these histories, I suppose.
I like the way there's kind of a strand through a lot of people's work of that idea that you're talking about, Phil, of not being fully resolved. So I think like yours is like a continuing practice of research and how that informs everything, and then Ben's can be changed and made into something else. And the same with Rachel's, always feels like it could be something else, in a short space of time. So I like that it's not like fixed.
Yeah, which is, I don't know if it speaks maybe in Congress to what modernism can be, as these permanent things.
I think I'm kind of more interested in late modernism in a way, with kind of challenges to modernism and those ideas of utopia. I think it kind of feels like that's not that achievable, and sometimes it creates a distance. So I think, if you come at it with like a modern slant, even in terms of location of where we are, I think to me, that's way more interesting.
That's actually a really key point, Grace. That I was even thinking earlier, whenever you were talking about your influences, that literary modernism was a little bit ahead of other forms in that it was really thinking about the first person narration, and for the first time, really, the I was really considered as an individual, and stream of consciousness came in alongside internal monologues. And I don't think that really came into play in things like architecture until late modernism. And late modernism is, I think, where things get particularly interesting, because they start to include all sorts of things like regionalism and specificities. And I think already by the time that modernism gets to Ireland from the mainland, from mainland Europe, from places like Germany, Switzerland, France, already it's kind of tainted and sullied and kind of it's kind of contaminated with regional ideas. It almost gets an accent, if you like. And in that reason, I've always seen modernism in Ireland as almost a kind of like trying to catch up to mainland Europe, but doing it in our own kind of way as we do. And therefore, a certain kind of richness and specificity kind of comes to the fore.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it sort of tallies with my research on Irish modernism that, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, that it is a lot more complex on the island of Ireland, and it references the past a lot more readily. And I think this is seen in a lot of the work on display in the exhibition. It's that point where, where history and modernism blend, and where you have that sort of tentative adoption of modernism is, for me, where the most interesting stuff happens. But I'm quite interested interested in, we are talking about modernism as this thing of the past, but if stuff is being unearthed and only talked about today, I mean, is it a thing of the past, or is it still this incredibly relevant living thing?
And where does that past start? Because there's so much of the modernism here that references like the megalithic and those sort of very old stone carvings that reappear, and those motifs that come through time and time again as well.
I'm actually going to go back to my research from when I was drawing the buildings, the additions up at the gallery. So I actually tend to find like aspects of modernism specifically tied to Northern Ireland. It ties into kind of our politics, because I've already touched on Craigavon, but I tend to find that partially the reason why you have sort of got like a lot of cities like Lisburn and Newry and Craigavon that have been developed into like commuter towns is because during the Troubles, Belfast city centre, or like the main streets in Belfast, where people were afraid to go out, or people just didn't feel safe. So that's kind of why we've got a lot of urbanized centres, or a lot of shopping centres outside Belfast. And also things like, I recently discovered the Richmond Centre in Derry, Londonderry. It was one of the ones we were initially discussing, but it's kind of like a hodgepodge of modernism and brutalism and just a load of glass and stuff. But I found it was designed as a multi-story centre because of all the car bombs and trouble going on the streets during that time, during the Troubles.
I feel like, well, postmodernism feels like it was a response, or kind of came from the Second World War. And I feel like definitely modernism is informed by the fact that we live in a post-conflict society, but it almost feels like we're not post-conflict. It's almost like we're still in conflict, but it's just a different conflict. It's kind of this prolonged, extended austerity, and a lot of, a lack of resources and different like mental health services and things. And so I feel like it's very contemporary, and it's those, even though you don't necessarily want to make work that's about the environment you live in, it kind of is already informed by that, can't not be. And so yeah, I feel like it is so contemporary in that aspect. And also I'm kind of interested in like that idea of psychogeography and exploring the environment around you, and I think that's seen in everyone's work. So I feel like that's ever changing.
Yeah, the psychogeography thing is interesting because it would be the goal of the modernist to design a city in which you can never get lost. But because the modernist project was, I was going to say never completed, but, only really just begun in Belfast and then stopped for various reasons. But we end up with fragments and somewhat kind of nonsensical infrastructure and kind of terrain vague. I'm not sure to pronounce that in French or not, around these kinds of neglected, incomplete pieces of infrastructure that become interesting for the urban wanderer, but almost seem like relics of a future that could have been at the same time. Like the West Link was never completed, for example. And now in 2021, we're kind of talking about the piece which is going to perhaps solve a lot of the West Link's issues, which is the York Street interchange in the north of the city. But rather than seeing that as a project for everybody to aid legibility of the city, and our love affair with the car, I think, is drawing to a close, as it should, because I think the car has single-handedly destroyed many great European cities. And now something like the York Street interchange, although it's going to complete a 1960s project, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, especially because it's going to decimate some adjacent communities like Sailor Town on Shore Road, Tigers Bay. So I think it's time for a kind of a revisionist modernist history, as I kind of said earlier, to kind of cherry pick what was good about it and kind of reassess if it's worth completing something or whether it's worth retroactively trying to fix things. But it's interesting, that we end up in this kind of bricolage environment of almost like a kind of a collage of urban identities and how that influences us. I know some people that have moved to Belfast, and for the first kind of couple of years, they could never get around the pit. Like there's no kind of coherent urban form to the thing.
It's interesting what you were just saying there about these unrealised or half-finished infrastructure projects that are dotted around. And I've been thinking about that idea of hauntology quite a lot, these sort of ghosts of past futures. And there is this sort of dualism of that in the exhibition, in that everything sort of refers back to something of the past, but also speaks of the contemporary or of the now. And maybe there is something in that. Maybe we do need to look back more and look at, what we saw for the future in the past.
I think it's interesting in Derry that An older type of infrastructure remains complete or almost complete in the city wall, and somehow that's been accepted. It's an infrastructure that is not one of facilitation. It doesn't facilitate access in the same way that the West Link intends to do, but it's a piece of defensive infrastructure.
Absolutely. I think what you're saying there is really interesting, and also just with your, those sort of things that come up and those ideas of connection with older fortresses and, forts, ring forts, standing stones. That's something that I've been exploring with the work that I made for the exhibition. Is something that is still sort of continued area of research, but that very much that idea of something that speaks to the past and the future, like you were saying, Matt, I think is really relevant, and sort of these ideas of creating relics that are artifacts of a past or a future that that may or may not have existed. You kind of can't believe stuff that sort of sits between. Yeah, I think that's definitely something I'm exploring with my work, and I think is the thing that comes up, as you said, in a few of the works in the show.
James.
Yes, I remember when we were talking back earlier near talking about the Rossville Flats, in the Bogside. You still kind of got like examples of like modernist, residential flats in the Bogside area of the city. And I think the other example I noticed was maybe the BT call center up in Derry, because it's like a big, massive purpose building. Not really something I would choose to illustrate, because people kind of associate call centers with minimum wage gig jobs, depression, so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, Derry was kind of a bit more challenging to find modernist examples than compared to other cities like London, Dublin, or even different towns.
There are so many pieces that are just part of the infrastructure. So like the vernacular housing, a lot of the social housing, these amazing shapes, sort of you get these sharp triangles that repeat and loop through. But all across the city, there are these pockets of these builds, and also the ecclesiastical architecture. Some of the most incredibly shaped different churches, and it's not one denomination. So you've got a Presbyterian church up by the big Tesco, sort of for anyone in Derry will know exactly where I mean. Or one of the Catholic churches as well. You have these sharp spire, sort of around Chantallow way as well. You have these incredible shapes and really ambitious, all-encompassing modernist buildings. But it's not that sort of landmark in the way that other modernist buildings might play out in other cities. It's just in the everyday here.
Yeah, especially just outside Derry, you've got Sion Mills, St. Teresa's Church. It's a shining example of modernism.
Also, Altnagelvin in the 60s or late 60s or early 70s when it was built was, I think, an explicitly Corbusian building, and I think it was cited as such. I think it's significantly altered by this point, maybe to the point of unrecognition, but that's a modernist slab block, in kind of Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation kind of style. And then actually a really fantastic piece of modernist art was then commissioned for that building. So William Scott, painter, was commissioned to make a mural for Altnagelvin when it was finished, which he actually worked on in the south of England, I think, where he lived, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I think Matt mentioned Ben Nicholson earlier. It's almost this kind of abstracted forms of still life, or it could be something which is more relating to nature or weather, or something more euphoric. It's the scale. It's almost like the Irish version of Robert Motherwell's Elegies. It's this really, really fantastic, huge mural that you can't help but be kind of consumed by. So there's two pieces that kind of go hand in hand that are explicitly related to Derry. I haven't seen for quite some time, but I think Altnagelvin's kind of a bit.
Yeah, it's definitely been added to over the years.
Yeah.
A discreet way of saying that. So we are going to spend the last talking about beyond the exhibition. So Philip, you are involved with Fruit Shop, a collective in Belfast. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So we're a collective of Belfast-based artists that are operating out of a residential cafe. And we merge food production with local growing initiatives and local food histories, and trying to find, I suppose, creative solutions to those kind of problems. And I suppose we're interested in ideas of creative labor and creative entrepreneurship, and the artist working in labor, and the things that kind of go to support our practices that have become our practices, I suppose.
Definitely feeds through, because I know you've done a lot of work that involves food previously, and actually this is one of the first, is it right to say this is the first time you've used objects in an exhibition?
Well, first time in a long time. Like in art college, I studied sculpture, and it was very object oriented. But that was coming out of having a studio and stuff. And I suppose my practice has been influenced by not having a studio, and I suppose taking more so of a curatorial path over the last number of years, which I kind of see now as a kind of stepping back from personal attachment to work and stuff, and almost this protective step away from it. Where now, more so now, I feel a lot more confident working with the things that I'm interested in and presenting that. And I suppose seeing the exhibition as this experiment in finding like a language or a vocabulary or a mechanism to represent this research in objects and stuff. So yeah, I'm interested to see how that develops.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And Grace, you're part of Array Collective. So how does Array tend to operate? And also, we can't not say again, huge congratulations on the Turner Prize nomination.
Thank you. Yeah, Array is a collective of 11 people, and we joined together to create collaborative actions in response to socio-political issues, and a lot of the work is around protest. And yeah, it's how do you create work collaboratively then within a gallery space and kind of bring together these aspects of, you know, protest and what that is, particularly within the north of Ireland in relation to England, Scotland, Wales. And so yeah, the Turner Prize nomination has been amazing, been a bit of a whirlwind. I think I'll only really come to terms with it in a couple of years. Yeah, we're just trying to make work at the minute, but you know, there's so many of us. We all have multiple jobs, have kids, pregnant, and moving house. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but I enjoy working collaboratively more than I enjoy working by myself. And it's been really great to come out of, or to feel like I'm coming out of a pandemic and then having more of a sense of community within that and making work that's responsive to what's happening.
See the collective, Gracie, you managed when the Turner Prize got announced. I see you all managed to grab attention from like a few blogs and articles, like from the conservative women, I think the Telegraph, if I'm right. Sort of these very kind of right wing places.
Yeah, I think those kind of responses, I actually find it really interesting. Yeah, I think we respond to kind of issues that we find within our mainly right-wing society. So yeah, I think we like to play with the critiques, and yeah, it's a reaction. I think we work best whenever we're reacting to things.
I think that segues neatly to James. You also work as an activist, and you created perhaps some particularly iconic images from some different campaigns that have been happening recently. So do you see it as integral to your practice, or do you kind of divide up this is where I'm an activist, this is where I'm an artist?
So I kind of think art and activism goes together, especially, recently I've just finished the window text poster for Lena Chen, it's just an American author, on erotic labor is essential labor. But for my inspiration for that project came from like a lot of research and the posters from the 1968 era of when all the different civil rights movements were going across the world, like Paris, for example. I think some of them are actually, the 1968 posters. I think some of them you can actually go see in the Museum of Free Derry in the Bogside. Regarding my own practice, things like LGBT rights, marriage equality, abortion rights in Northern Ireland, it's been something that I've very much been observing for a good number of years now. It's probably one of the things so people sort of our generation would remember, like there was a period, I think it was 2015, marriage equality got legalized in the Republic of Ireland, and the UK already had it. And in 2018, Ireland got the 8th Amendment repealed, and then for this period of time, we were this small isolated corner in the northwest of Europe, and like we were just so behind with LGBT rights and abortion rights. Then fast forward to 2019, I think it was, Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, she got the bill put through in Westminster for same-sex marriage and abortion rights to be approved and or to be rolled in Northern Ireland. So I kind of made a couple of images. One one saying Ulster says now, and the other saying save sodomy from Ulster. But the kind of typeface is, it's a parody from two DUP unionist campaigns, the infamous Ulster says no and the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaigns led by Ian Paisley. But the typeface, the colours, they're all based off the Ulster says no poster from that time period. I've gotten printed onto like t-shirts, badges, posters, and the Save Sodomy badge is actually on display in the Ulster Museum. But I think art and activism, it goes together with practice because, like, generally, so to speak, a lot of artists, they voice opinions in their artwork. One of my favorite illustrators, Keith Haring, he brought a lot of awareness to HIV and gay rights in his artwork, especially because he was from that community and like he unfortunately died quite young because of AIDS. But when you look at different contemporary artists, they always use their artwork as a platform and as a voice for their opinions and messages. And then regarding the Ulster Museum, I drew the two Tato men from north and south, like in the statue up in Derry where they're reaching out to shake hands. And I just sort of done as a commentary on Brexit and peace in Northern Ireland with the Irish border, because it's unstable at the best of times sometimes with politics up here. But I just sort of done it as a light-hearted thing, and it kind of really took off. It was iconic, and a lot of people kind of resonated with it. But I mean, there's always something going on here, politics-wise, that people have just been able to like take the piss out of, or like parody from. I mean, like Array Collective, as we've been speaking. I mean, I think was it you, Gracie, during Pride one year, someone dressed up as Stormont and an RHI boiler. I think that was Array Collective.
Yeah, that was Sheila and Sinead Bracknacastle.
Yeah, just so much going on politics-wise here to laugh at. Well, laugh or cry, I should say.
Indeed.
You don't laugh, you will cry.
Yeah. And Rachel, in your other incarnation, you're on the Black Box. So how have you found programming that, and are there overlaps?
Well, I think just the conversation there about art and activism is something that's really relevant, to the Black Box and I as director. We are a venue that provides space for protest, for communities, for people to meet, to share ideas. It gives voice to people that maybe are underrepresented in society and need a space to meet and to formalise themselves and have a public platform as well. So in that capacity, it's really important space, for the city in terms of allowing room to incubate ideas, to experiment, to learn, to try things. And that's so key to have an opportunity in a place that is accessible and inclusive to be able to do that. And we obviously welcoming space and work very hard on, achieving that ethos and atmosphere and bring it to everything we do, in terms of your actual experience being in the space, programming put together, our staff team and training, right through to board level. And in terms of overlap, I don't really know where the Black Box ends and the rest of my life begins. It's sort of like ingrained into everything. I mean, like a lot of artists and people work in the arts and cultural sector, I mean, often you're wearing many hats and you're juggling a lot of things. I mean, I don't know if anyone here knows any artists that make a living from being an artist, particularly in Ireland. So it's always you're doing that plus other stuff, quite often a full-time job or a couple of jobs or plus volunteer and doing a whole combination of things. And I mean, that is a really difficult balance, and it is something that a lot of people struggle with. And I think there are, ways, there could be more resources and support here in terms of supporting artists and that way of working and being able to support yourself in what you do, and a real change in the value that's placed, on artists and arts here from the government level. But sorry, I'm like, what else is my point? It is, I suppose there's a lot of creativity, I can bring into the job as well. I mean, yes, there's the management side of things, there's the admin side of things, there's the funding, the applications, there's all of that. But I do, try and bring in a lot of creativity in terms of of design and delivering, a lot of the programs that we do and the events that we host there, and really try and use that as a space to utilize my creativity in a different way outside of, I suppose, my sculpture practice and thinking of work in a gallery sort of context, really thinking about audiences and how they experience events. And I suppose a lot of what we like to put on is stuff that is quite immersive and experimental in terms of how people interact with the space and interact with art, and very like cross-platform and collaborative types of practices. Is something we really like to give a space to as well. I suppose an example of that is the Neo Neo project that I developed with Kwame Daniels from Bounce Culture, and that was very much about just sort of trying to create a specific space for visual artists and musicians to collaborate across their practices and their different ways of creating work and creative content, and then present it to an audience or a work in progress to an audience that was then experienced in a very live and immersive way. And that's something that, yeah, I've been really just really happy to be able to have the space to develop, and I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I wasn't in the position that I was at the Black Box and had access to that space and those connections. So I think that's sort of added to my practice and what I do. And I suppose my work is, there's a continued thread there about I create installations. I think about how people interact with work and objects in a space and move around space, and that's me. It does connect together.
And finally, briefly to you, Ben, you talked a little bit about working between or across, and sort of it's all as one between architecture and as an artist. So I'm curious to know, I know that you teach as well at the university, but do you build buildings? I can't find a way to style it out. Oh, I need to
gets other people to build them for him.
Maybe I can also go back to my previous point, where actually my installations in kind of artistic practice, I do actually physically construct them. So there's another, no denying. Part of my kind of artistic process is actually to be more involved in the physical construction of the work. So whenever I make a kind of a built installation, I do always want to, and more often than not I do build it myself, which is of course more at odds in the way an architect might usually work. But I think it's important to kind of get your hands dirty sometimes. It's a complex question. I guess it depends what we're kind of talking about. I mean, sometimes I have worked for years. I've worked in architecture practices, and I've had incredible collaborations there, and always working towards a shared goal. And I mean, in my artistic practice, I tend not to collaborate so much, not because I don't want to, but because I guess the opportunities just haven't really arisen so much. But in architecture offices, collaboration is kind of the base level. Like everything happens in shared discussion, and we always presented our sketches from the day at the end and kind of had a chat about it. You never are in a bubble. I would always be shouting across the room to someone like, can you send me this gutter detail that you took a photograph of in Italy, or what's the name of that guy that does that really nice kind of stairs detail or whatever. And then kind of we're always really critical of each other in a really kind of positive sense, that we're always working towards a shared goal, which is a building that everybody sees as appropriate and generous, and kind of within those kind of really difficult frameworks in Northern Ireland, which is very, very difficult to get a piece of architecture made in Northern Ireland. I guess in the context of this show, I was presenting, a work as an artist. Like I do kind of differentiate day jobs and my artistic practice. And also I would never want to speak on anyone's behalf. So I wouldn't present a work that comes out of my own kind of artistic portfolio as a work of part of an architecture practice who has clients and, turnovers and all of these different things that I do kind of draw the line there. So yes, I have in the past worked on built buildings, but I guess the teaching practice is much more close to my artistic practice, in that how I teach architecture is one that's really self-reflective, almost in a form of kind of artistic research. Like I really get our students to look inside themselves, see what they're interested in, try to get them to spin a project out of that. We tend to be very loose as to what we dictate towards them, but more often than not, it's just a site. So we plonk them down somewhere. Last year, it was in first semester, they were on the Lagan Meadows, and they just had to walk around, find a space for intervention and do something that they deemed appropriate, and then somehow spin a thesis out of that. So I think as soon as you start identifying points for intervention, you can't do that without putting some of yourself into it. As a student, you're working outside of these kind of regulatory frameworks. You're not worried about getting planning permission. You're not worried about budget. You're just doing something which is important to you. And I think that's just exactly how an artistic process works. And it's how I also make projects. Something that I'm working on right now is a built project in public space based south of the Netherlands. And I did it in exactly how I teach my students, which is find an area for which you think something needs to happen and try to do it.
Hearing you all talk about the collaborative nature of your practices is, I think, a really nice note to end on. Thank you all so much for your time and sharing your thoughts, interests, and practices with us today. Irish Modernisms is open until the 18th of September 2021 at CCA Derry, Londonderry. And for those of you unable to visit, you can see images at our website, ccadld.org, and across our socials at ccadld. This roundtable is made possible thanks to the support of Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, the Art Fund, British Art Network, the Paul Mellon Centre, Yale, Arts Council England and Tate. And thanks to Jessica Dukes, Martin Myrone, Danielle Goulet, Mel Bradley, Laura McCafferty and Fiona Allen. Thank you for listening.